webinar, and so we will overrun on the questions as well, so don't worry. So just to start off, Tara, if you could quickly introduce yourself, and then we'll go down in order.
Okay, so I'm Tara Garnett from the Food Climate Research Network at the University of Oxford.
Hi everyone, my name is Cécile Godde. I'm a PhD student at CSIRO, which is a federal government agency for scientific research here in Australia.
Hello, I'm Elin Röös. I'm a researcher at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences.
Hello, I'm Adrian Muller, a senior researcher at the Research Institute of Organic Agriculture, FiBL in Switzerland, and the Federal Institutes of Technology, also in Switzerland.
Hello, I'm Pete Smith at the University of Aberdeen. I'm Professor of Soils and Global Change.
Hello, I'm Imke de Boer. I'm the head of the Animal Production Systems Group in the Animal Sciences Department of Wageningen University.
Okay, perfect. Tara, if you could go ahead with the first three questions, and then I will look at the questions from the Q&A.
Okay, so there was one, and we've sort of bundled the questions a bit. There was a question that really can be framed as, under what circumstances can grazing systems provide greenhouse gas removal benefits? And I think, were we going to, could perhaps Pete Smith answer that question?
Yeah, okay. So as Tara has already shown in the presentation and as we discuss in the report, there are some circumstances. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, cool. There are some circumstances whereby if you have a very degraded soil, putting a grassland and grazing livestock onto that system could increase the amount of soil organic matter. But this is almost always outweighed by the methane emissions from the animals that are, from the livestock that are then grazing that. So with a very low stocking density, with very high carbon sequestration rates on degraded soils, you may get some benefits, but these are going to be very rare compared to the situations where higher stocking densities, lower carbon sequestration rates on non-degraded soils, where the methane emissions will greatly outweigh the benefits to the climate compared to the soil carbon sequestration. So the short answer is that those cases will be very rare, and when we look at it in the aggregate, the grazed livestock systems are actually causing a significant climate warming rather than a climate mitigation.
Okay, thanks, Pete. There was a sort of second set of questions, which was really about, I suppose it sounds like an obvious question, if you are going to eat beef, is it better for climate to eat grass-fed or grain-fed? And did we even consider that question? I mean, that's the sort of question that we've been asked already by the media. And I think there are four ways of answering that question. Firstly is that the question of whether it's better to eat meat from one system as a question to meat from another system. We just looked at climate change, and in fact, to make a decision like that, there are a whole host of other issues that you're going to need to be looking at, which we touched upon as not addressing. So the animal welfare issue, the nutritional question, the role of different livestock systems in biodiversity, in zoonotic disease resistance, in antibiotics resistance, and so on and so forth. So I think it would be overly simplistic to base your decision about eating one thing as opposed to eating another thing on the basis of one dimension only. We explicitly didn't do a comparison of grassland or grazing system versus grain-fed systems. What we did find when looking at the grazing system that I've tried to emphasize is that there was such a huge diversity in what could remotely be described as a grazing system that it was very difficult to generalize there. And the same could also be said about animals that are grain-fed or animals that are in mixed crops livestock systems. So I think generalizations of that kind are not particularly helpful. And I think perhaps the most, rather than, I would say, eat eat what you feel best fits the range of different criteria that you feel to be important, but eat less of it. I think that's the most important point that we might want to make, is that rather than don't assume that one is actually going to deliver benefits for the climate, because it's not. The optimum thing to do is to cut back across the board and to consider other factors that might be important to you when making a decision about which animal product to eat. So that was my question, one of the questions there. And then there was a third question, which was more policy related, which is, what are the implications of the report's findings for policymakers? And I'd like to ask Cécile Godde to answer that one, if you don't mind, Cécile.
Thank you, Tara. So what we found is that grass-fed livestock is not a climate change solution. So grazing livestock are net contributors to the climate problem, as are all livestock. And so what's important is that the overall impact of grazing livestock on climate change depends on the net balance between all emissions and all removals. And there are also many trade-offs between carbon sequestration, nitrous oxide emissions, and methane that need consideration. Regarding the carbon sequestration topic, well, the potential contribution of grazing ruminant to soil carbon sequestration is, as Tara mentioned, small, time limited and reversible, and also substantially outweighed by the greenhouse gas emissions that they generate. I'd like to emphasize here as well that we need to keep carbon in the ground, as released carbon causes permanent warming effects. And also, I guess my final point, as Tara said, is that to limit damaging changes in land use and associated greenhouse gas emissions, well, we need to reduce our production and consumption of animal products of all kinds and in all systems. And this might give room for grass-fed systems, which may deliver in certain contexts benefits. However, grazing systems are not the climate change solution.
Thank you, Cécile. Okay, so we have a question which Elin, Röös, perhaps you could answer, which is how much will we have to cut meat and dairy consumption by on an individual basis to help limit warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees?
Okay, yes, it's a question that you really can't give a scientific answer to, because it depends so much on how much we can reduce emissions in other sectors. So depending on how much we can reduce emissions from energy and transports and so on, that will leave us an emission space that we could use for food. But most certainly, to give you some kind of feeling, I think that in high consuming countries like the UK or Sweden, we need to cut down to maybe 25% or something of what we are currently consuming, at least, to have some chance. But it very much depends on how much we can reduce emissions in other sectors.
Thank you. So a question about working with caterers. I work with caterers to help them make sustainable decisions about food procurement. Without meaning to compare grass-fed with mixed-fed beef, how would you advise to give people clear guidelines? Is it a case of there is no real hiding place, just use less meat, dairy, fish? Again, I think I come back to the point that I kind of really tried to emphasize, which is that the decision about the production system is not one that's just based on climate change considerations. Animal welfare, for example, might be a really important consideration, or supporting local jobs or livelihoods or whatever it might be. And I think it's, if we want to address climate change, then cutting back on animal products across the board is the way to go. If you want to support other aspects of sustainability, then you may be able to make particular decisions about, grass-fed as opposed to non-grass-fed, or ruminant versus non-ruminant meat. So I think we need to look beyond the climate change domain when making public procurement or private procurement decisions. Okay, so there's a question: is it known how total emissions from ruminants on the planet has changed? There are presumably a lot fewer wild ruminants on the planet today compared to before 2050, and at the same time more domestic ruminants. So basically this is a question about whether ruminants in the past were producing as much methane as farmed ruminants are producing today. Adrian, would you like to answer this question, please?
Oh,
or Adrian, or Pete, or Imke, I don't mind.
Yeah, I think this is more on your side, Imke.
Well,
I mean, I could have a go because we covered it in the report. If that would help.
It's on page 81, but maybe you can just summarize.
Yes, or perhaps Cécile. Cécile, you can answer it.
Yes. I'm happy to respond. Actually, it's a very interesting question because it's something that is quite often raised. So, because some people say that because historically wild ruminants roamed on many grasslands and were producing methane, then some people say that farmed ruminants emissions need to be seen in this context of historical baseline counts. And well, we have identified a study which from Smith et al. From PNAS 2016, which showed that methane emissions from wild ruminants 11,000 years ago were actually very similar to methane emissions from current domestic livestock. But what's important to keep in mind here is that the context 11,000 years ago was very different. So we had much less the planet was much less populated. We were not using fossil fuel. And so making comparisons between such a long time ago and our current situation is actually quite meaningless in that sense. And also we can also consider that wild ruminants were adding some ecological value as well, that some grazing systems with monospecies pastures and single species animals might not provide. I don't know if anyone wants to add something to that.
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I mean, the population of the Earth was measured in a few million as opposed to 7 billion and counting. It was, everything was so different. There's a question here for how much do emissions from livestock need to decline by 2050 to fit within the RCP 2.6 scenario, which is effectively leads us to, keeps us within a 2-degree world. Pete, perhaps you could address this?
Yeah, okay. I think the answer is very similar to the one that Elin gave earlier, which is that depends on how much effort we make in other sectors. So if we reduce emissions aggressively and immediately in all other sectors, that maybe leaves us a slightly larger sort of wedge of emissions that we could produce from the livestock system. But 2.6, RCP 2.6, for those of you who don't know, is a climate scenario which stabilizes the climate around about 2 degrees Celsius. So that's the sort of the Paris climate levels of future climate change. That would require quite a significant reduction in over-consuming countries. So as Elin already said in a previous response, over-consuming countries, largely developed and industrialized countries, would need to reduce consumption to around about 25% of current levels. In fact, if you look at that, the leftovers slide that Tara's already presented, that shows you how much we are over consuming protein and how much we would be able to do if we're heading for a sort of a more climate friendly future. So we need to significantly reduce our emissions from livestock, and that means ultimately a reduction in consumption to about 25% of where we are now in developed countries.
Okay, thank you, Pete. I now have a question for Adrian, which is, to what extent are organic grazing systems better at sequestering carbon than non-organic grazing systems?
Yeah, the data on sequestration in organic versus non-organic grazing systems is really scarce. So we have some data, we have quite some data on comparative cropland, and there we see a higher sequestration rate in organic systems. But on the grasslands, I would expect the difference to be much smaller if you correct for different nitrogen inputs and maybe species composition, stocking rates, because grasslands per se are already agricultural systems that sequester more carbon than croplands, and where the soil is much less disturbed. So I think there it's much more important whether the grassland you have is more like on a degrading side because it's overstocked and such things, which is less the case in organic systems where you have certain limitations on stocking rates and so on. But I would say just from the systems perspective, the differences will not be that big as for croplands.
Okay. And there's a follow-on question to that, which is perhaps for Pete, which is it possible to measure sequestration rates of specific sites, such as farms?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it is possible to measure sequestration rates. So the most reliable way to do that is to measure the soil carbon stocks. So the difficulty is that soil carbon takes a long time to change. So it may take 5 or 10 years before you could see any change in soil carbon at an individual farm, and you might need to take many samples in order to get the statistical power to show that difference. It's basically because you've got a small change on a very large background. So you've got a very large amount of carbon in the soil, and you're trying to measure a relatively small change. So it takes quite a lot of time to do that, and it will also require quite a lot of samples to detect that change. But it is possible, and it's something that we do regularly in the research arena. It's probably going to be more difficult for individual farmers to do that. It can be done.
Pete, as a follow-on to that, can you perhaps talk a little bit about the difficulties of accurately measuring carbon sequestration rates? Because I mean, if I'm just sort of somebody who wants to go along with the DIY kit, am I going to get an accurate reading, or is it a little bit more involved than that? No,
it's a little bit more involved than that, I'm afraid, largely due to the number of samples that you need to take. So you need to take a lot of samples, as sort of a before and after samples, or you can take from twin plots where you've got a treatment. For example, you've changed to grazing land, and on the other one you've not changed to grazing land. You can then take those measurements, but it's not something you can do with a kit. You need to send that away to a lab to get the carbon and the nitrogen analysed. It can be done, and the costs of doing so are coming down, but it's more something that happens sort of within research projects than just in a do-it-yourself way.
Okay. We have a follow-on question to the historical wild ruminants question that Cécile answered. Somebody's commented that if emissions from wild ruminants were comparable to what they are from farmed animals today, then other differences such as fossil fuel use would seem to be the driving force behind climate change. Well, yes, absolutely. Obviously, we know that the majority of the problem of climate change is caused by our demand and our use of fossil fuels, but that doesn't. What our point here is that a good chunk of the problem is nevertheless a consequence of our food system, part of which is driven by soil carbon release, so through deforestation and land clearance, much of which has been for the rearing of animals, and some of which is direct emissions of methane and nitrous oxide. So I think it's really important to emphasize that no one is saying that grazing systems or beef or livestock or whatever it is are the single biggest cause of climate change. They are a contributor to an already dangerously overheated set of problems, and that if we are to address meet our Paris climate commitments, then no sector of society can afford to be a special case. We need to act across all sectors and across all issues.
Yeah, may I add something, Tara?
Yes.
Because I think also one of the things that are not mentioned is the difference in human population between history and now. And actually, this is where the difference comes from. In the past, we did have a lot of wild ruminants emitting methane, but we had a lot less humans. And indeed, because we have more humans now, we are not able to have so many ruminants.
Yeah. Thank you, Imke. Okay, I think we have one last question. I personally don't know the answer. Is anyone trying to replicate the data analysis of the Savory Institute? Do any of the other panelists know if anyone's trying to replicate Savory's
what about Elin's report, Tara?
As in the Swedish report?
Yeah.
Elin?
Yeah, it's not really a replication of the, well, maybe it is. I'm a little bit uncertain what you mean with the question. But anyway, I could recommend a report we wrote that's available also in English, where we looked at the different claims by Savory and went through that. And we also in detail went through his claims when it comes to mitigation of climate change. So that could be an interesting read if you want to know more about that.
I think there's one other thing to add, which is that the whole concept of holistic grazing, which is sometimes called, and its variants like moderate, high intensity, mob grazing, all that sort of thing. There have been attempts to replicate that in different contexts, and the results have always been very, very mixed. And the report that Elin is referring to reviews some of the studies that try and capture the effects of those different grazing management techniques on things like biodiversity and soil organic matter content and so forth. And they give quite different and slightly contradictory results, but either way, the differences between those systems and what you might say more conventional systems tend to be small and different answers on different patches of land.
And also, I'd like to add something about for example, holistic grazing management, or it's not always easy to replicate because it's not just a grazing management practice, or it's more a process of decision making and planning based on the observation of nature, which means that it's not always actually easy to replicate in a scientific way as well.
What is maybe also important is that you even can have specific situations where we have high sequestration rates under a very specific grazing system, but this is not the average, and these extrapolations for the whole world are likely based on such high-end rates, be they observed or not, but they will never be applicable to the average situation. And that's also a bias that is often made in such claims, that you take most extreme values to show what would happen if those would be implemented everywhere, which is just way off what could be possible.
Okay, so we're on our last question now, which is a very ended one. Since the social values contributed by grasslands are not uniform, e.g. large producer versus small producer versus subsistence herders, are there ethical considerations you see as particularly important in policy setting and programming to reduce net emissions? Now, I'm going to just put that to all of you. Do any of you have any reflections on that question?
So Pete here. I think it's a really important issue. So we've just looked at the issue through a climate lens, and I think, you know, what we've also said that we've not looked at the issues to do with, you know, subsistence herders and the cultural value of meat, and the fact that livestock in many cultures and societies has a very important role. So I think that it is important to just step back a little bit from the climate lens, the climate only lens, the greenhouse gas emission lens, and recognise that there are many other things at play with livestock and with livestock production. From a social and economic viewpoint, reducing net emissions, I think, has to be the overall target. But to do that, I think that over-consuming countries do need to consume less livestock products, and we need to help people find ways in the future to avoid overconsumption of livestock products, not just for the climate, but also for their health in the future as they go through the transition from developing countries through to more industrialized countries.